Jerusalem. Few names evoke such a deep resonance in the human consciousness. It is a city of gold and blood, a symbol of celestial peace and an epicenter of earthly conflict. Its history is an echo that resonates through millennia, a promise and an open wound in the heart of the world. But how did a rocky promontory in the arid hills of Judea become the spiritual axis of three great religions? To understand its enigma, we must strip away the centuries and travel to its most remote origins, to a time when this place was merely a silent promise in the landscape of Canaan. Our story begins more than 5,000 years ago, in the 3rd millennium before Christ. The Mediterranean Levant was a melting pot of civilizations, a strategic corridor where the empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia projected their power and influence. In this fertile yet contested land, the Canaanites flourished. They were a collection of Semitic peoples, skilled farmers and traders who established a network of city-states and villages. Their world was governed by a pantheon of gods who ruled over harvests, seasons, and fate, a spiritual universe deeply connected to the cycles of nature. In this setting, a particular hill began to stand out, protected by deep valleys and situated at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. It offered an undeniable defensive and economic advantage. The earliest Canaanite settlements were modest, but they laid the foundations for what was to come. And then, emerging from the mists of history, came the Jebusites, an enigmatic people, likely a Canaanite tribe, masters of stone and strategy, who saw in this hill not only a home but a natural fortress. They encircled it with walls that seemed to spring from the very rock, transforming the settlement into a formidable citadel. The identity of the Jebusites has been the subject of study, but their legacy is indisputable. They were the first architects of Jerusalem's resilience. Around the 18th century before Christ, their control over the city was absolute. They fortified it with such skill that its reputation for being impregnable began to spread. This was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a long process of migration and consolidation of power that altered the balance in the region. These solid walls would become the main challenge for all who coveted the city in the centuries to come. The story of the Jebusites in Jerusalem is marked by decisions that defined their fate. Their king, Adonizedek, stands as a symbol of this tenacity, a leader who, according to texts, challenged the powers of his era. His military capability was key to preserving the city's independence against incursions from powerful neighbors. This raises a fundamental question: what would have happened if the Jebusites had not erected those defenses? Would Jerusalem have become the historical and spiritual epicenter we know, or would it have simply been one more of the many cities forgotten by time? As the centuries passed, pressure on Canaan intensified. From the desert, a new people advanced with unwavering faith and purpose, the Israelite tribes. Led by figures such as Joshua, their narrative of conquest propelled them toward a land they considered promised by their God. The clash with the Canaanite cities was inevitable, but one of them resisted with particular tenacity: the Jebusite stronghold of Jerusalem. The confrontation that loomed was not merely a battle for territory. It was a clash of destinies, a struggle for the soul of the city. Events culminated in a legendary siege at the end of the 11th century before Christ. This conflict became an epic tale of ingenuity against determination. The Jebusites, confident behind their imposing walls, defended their home with a ferocity that entered history. They mocked their attackers, convinced that their fortress was invincible. But before them stood a young and ambitious Israelite leader destined to change history: David. The intrigue intensifies. How could an army, no matter how determined, take a city that boasted of being impregnable? What secret strategy or bold stroke would David employ to finally claim the most coveted prize of Canaan? The fall of the Jebusite citadel was a turning point of monumental consequences. David's victory not only inaugurated a new era for Jerusalem, but catapulted it onto the world stage, laying the groundwork for its transformation into the sacred capital of the Kingdom of Israel. The Jebusite fortress became the City of David, a symbol of unity and power for a people previously divided. However, the spirit of the Jebusites did not completely fade, leaving a persistent enigma. What elements of their culture, their knowledge, or even their blood endured in the identity of the new capital? In conclusion, the inaugural chapter of Jerusalem immerses us in a past of anonymous heroes, decisive battles, and a legacy forged in stone and will. The Canaanites and Jebusites, though often relegated to the background in the grand narrative, were the essential protagonists who set the stage for the future greatness of the city. The question resonates in the air: what other secrets and mysteries lie still beneath the layers of time, waiting to be discovered in the depths of Jerusalem? As we close this chapter, the echo of ancient conflicts prepares us for the next episode in the saga of Jerusalem. The story of David's conquest awaits us, a tale of ambition, strategy, and faith that will forever change the destiny of this emblematic city. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The instability in the region would soon give way to an era of consolidation, where the echo of ambition would resonate in the hills of Jerusalem. In the shadows of history, the account of David's conquest stands as a milestone that would redefine the destiny of this ancient city. The Jerusalem known to the Jebusites, a bastion of fortifications and cultures, was preparing to confront a new power emerging with unwavering determination. During the 11th century before Christ, the political landscape in the region was particularly volatile. The Hebrew people, after their long pilgrimage, sought to consolidate their identity and establish a lasting kingdom in the land they considered promised. The tribe of Judah, from which David descended, had achieved remarkable cohesion but still faced internal tensions and external threats. The Philistines, a warrior people with well-established city-states along the coast, represented a constant challenge to the Hebrew tribes. Meanwhile, the tribes of Israel remained divided, competing for control and unity. Amidst this chaos, David emerged, a young man who had gained notoriety as a warrior and demonstrated deep conviction. Determined to unify his people and claim Jerusalem as the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. David, who had achieved fame after his legendary confrontation with Goliath, became the leader of the Hebrews. But his rise to monarchy was not without difficulties. The figure of Saul, the first king of Israel, loomed as a threatening shadow. The relationship between David and Saul became complex, characterized by envy and suspicion. Despite these tensions, David understood that the consolidation of his power depended on his ability to make bold and strategic decisions. The conquest of Jerusalem would not only involve the capture of a city, it would represent the creation of a tangible symbol that would unite the scattered tribes under one banner. The Jebusite stronghold rose over strategic terrain, surrounded by imposing walls that had withstood the assaults of previous enemies. However, David, with his characteristic cunning, opted for an unexpected approach. According to biblical chronicles, he sent his men to infiltrate the city through an underground water system known as the Gihon Spring. This bold move not only took the Jebusites by surprise, but also demonstrated David's ability to combine military strength with tactical intelligence. On the night of the assault, the Hebrew warriors, led by Joab, slipped through those dark waters, carrying the hope of a unified future. With the fall of Jerusalem, a new chapter opened before David and his people. The city, renamed as the City of David, transformed into the heart of the kingdom. The choice of Jerusalem as the capital was not merely an act of conquest, it was a symbol of David's era, a legacy that would resonate throughout history. However, this victory was not without challenges. The unification of the tribes under one flag required more than the capture of a stronghold. David faced the precarious task of maintaining peace among tribes that had been rivals for generations. The repercussions of his conquest were immediate. The establishment of Jerusalem as the capital marked the beginning of a new era of prosperity and centralization of power. David not only built his palace, but also laid the foundations for the construction of the temple, a project that would materialize during the reign of his son Solomon. However, as David's glory grew, so did tensions with the northern tribes and the Philistines, who would not passively accept the rise of a new power in the region. The mystery that endures through the centuries is the legacy of David and the nature of his conquest. Was his victory an act of divine justice, the fulfillment of a promise made to his people, or an example of human ambition that often ignores the consequences of war? The story of David becomes a mirror of human struggles where power and faith intertwine in a complex fabric of decisions and sacrifices. With the city unified, the stage was set for the rise of his successor, Solomon, whose reign would lead Jerusalem to a new peak of splendor. In the next chapter, we will explore the magnificence of Solomon, who, with his wisdom and vision, would build a temple that would not only consolidate the faith of his people, but also leave an indelible mark on the heart of Jerusalem. What secrets still awaited in the depths of this sacred city? The consolidation of power in Jerusalem would soon flourish under the reign of Solomon, the son of David. In a period characterized by prosperity, peace, and expansion, Solomon would become a legendary king, whose figure would be remembered not only for his wisdom, but also for a project that endures through the centuries, the construction of the first temple. This temple, the architectural jewel of his reign, would establish Jerusalem as the religious epicenter of the Hebrew people, a legacy that still resonates in contemporary beliefs. As Solomon ascended to the throne around the year 970 before Christ, the Kingdom of Israel had become a powerful entity in the region. The political stability, a direct result of the military victories of his father David, had allowed trade to thrive and alliances with neighboring nations to flourish. The influence of the Phoenicians, especially through the city of Tyre, was felt in Jerusalem, bringing not only wealth but also innovative construction techniques and high-quality materials. The city, in this landscape, was transforming into a bustling center of trade and culture, a beacon of civilization in a world often engulfed in chaos. Solomon, in his quest to solidify his legacy, made crucial decisions. One of the most significant milestones was the alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, who not only provided him with skilled labor but also the precious cedar wood indispensable for the construction of the temple. This collaboration not only symbolized a strategic bond but also reflected Solomon's openness to external influences, a characteristic that would define his reign. The construction of Solomon's temple, which began approximately in the 4th year of his reign, was a monumental project that spanned 7 years. It was erected on Mount Moriah, the place where, according to tradition, Abraham had been willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, a site laden with profound religious significance. The building was not only intended to be a place of worship, but also represented the dwelling of God among his people, a space where the divine and the human intertwined. The design of the temple was grand and filled with details. Influenced by Phoenician construction practices, the temple featured an outer courtyard, a gathering place for the people, and a sanctum sanctorum, the most sacred place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The latter, a deeply revered object, contained the tablets of the law, symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. The construction was a testament to Solomon's power, who, through his artistry and devotion, sought not only to build a sacred place but also to cement his authority as a ruler chosen by divinity. However, the splendor of Solomon's temple was not without controversies. The monumentality of this project required considerable labor, leading to the imposition of tributes and forced labor among the Israelites. Social tensions began to surface, and although the temple was erected as a symbol of unity, it also revealed the shadow of oppression. Was it truly a place of peace and worship, or a reminder of the sacrifice of many for the glory of one? The impact of the temple was immediate and profound. Jerusalem solidified as the religious center of the Hebrew people, attracting pilgrims from all over the kingdom and beyond. Religious festivities, such as Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles, took on new meaning, becoming moments of gathering and celebration around this majestic building. Despite the appearance of unity and devotion, the underlying tensions did not disappear. With the death of Solomon, political instability and internal conflicts would begin to blur the splendor of his legacy. The mystery surrounding Solomon's temple is deep and enduring. Although its construction marked a milestone in the history of Jerusalem, the question persists: what really happened to this dazzling temple? Why was its splendor ephemeral and its legacy shrouded in shadows of destruction? The story of the first temple would be only the prelude to a series of events that would lead to the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of its people. Events that invite us to reflect on the fragility of glory and the nature of historical change. As the echoes of the temple's construction fade, an uncertain future looms over Jerusalem. In the next chapter, we will explore the tragic fall of this sacred city before the Babylonian power and the exile of its people, an event that would change the course of its history forever. How would the splendor built by Solomon crumble? And what lessons would be drawn from this painful experience? It was a time of tumultuous changes in the ancient East, where the echoes of the greatness of Jerusalem began to fade on the horizon. The city, once radiant under the leadership of Solomon, stood on the brink of an abyss. The growing threat of Babylon, an expanding empire looming like an ominous shadow over the kingdom of Judah, foretold a tragic fate. The fall of Jerusalem would not merely be a territorial loss, it would be a devastation of the very soul of its people. An exile that would leave indelible scars on their history. In the 6th century before Christ, Jerusalem was a symbol of resistance and faith, but also a place of internal and external tensions. Political alliances were fragile and palace intrigues abounded. The kings of Judah, from Josiah to Jeconiah, faced critical decisions in an environment where loyalty could change with the breeze. The influence of nearby powers such as Egypt and Assyria further complicated the situation. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, and the question that resonated in the halls of power was how to protect the walled city from an enemy that sought not only to conquer but to destroy. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylon, emerged as the protagonist of this tragedy. His ambition knew no bounds, and his strategy was clear: weaken Judah through sieges and political pressures. In the year 605 before Christ, after the victory at the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to Jerusalem. There, in an act of control, he carried out the first deportation of nobles and youths, among them the future prophet Daniel. This first blow was merely a prelude, a warning that echoed like a toll in the heart of the city. The decisions of the leaders of Judah, especially Jeconiah, who took the throne at a critical moment, were decisive. The lack of unity and distrust among the leaders led to a pact with Egypt, a strategy that would prove disastrous. The hope of salvation faded, and in its place, fear emerged. Could Jerusalem withstand the Babylonian onslaught? Or was it already condemned by its own mistakes? In the year 586 before Christ, the final siege took place. Jerusalem, weakened by years of internal and external conflicts, could not withstand the military might of Nebuchadnezzar. The city was besieged, and its walls, which had protected its inhabitants for centuries, crumbled before the Babylonian force. The fall was brutal, an event that left the city in ruins. The Temple of Solomon, a symbol of divine presence and Jewish identity, was looted and destroyed. In the silence that followed the devastation, the lament of a desolate people could be heard, watching their home and faith crumble. The immediate consequences were devastating. Thousands of inhabitants, including leaders, priests, and artisans, were taken to Babylon, where they faced an uncertain future. This exile was more than a physical displacement. It was a rupture of the cultural and religious fabric that had sustained the Jewish community. On the banks of the Euphrates, far from their land, a troubling question arose. Could a people maintain their identity in distance? What did it mean to be Jewish in a world that seemed to have forgotten their legacy? The exile in Babylon became a profound enigma. The geographical distance did not erase the hopes or longings of the exiles. But the lack of a tangible home and the constant presence of the oppressor created a void that challenged their cultural survival. Traditions began to be documented, sacred texts took shape, and the Jewish people found solace in the written word, seeking answers in the past while yearning for an uncertain future. However, the story does not end here. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile were not merely an ending, but the beginning of a process of transformation that would define Jewish identity in the centuries to come. How would Jerusalem be rebuilt, and what legacy would those who lived through the exile leave behind? This dark chapter of Jewish history, filled with suffering and resistance, raises questions that resonate across millennia. As the echo of destruction faded, the return of the exiles began to take shape in the distance. The Edict of Cyrus, which would allow the return to the Promised Land, awaited on the horizon. The story of Jerusalem was far from over. In fact, it was about to be reborn from its ashes. That crisis would soon transform into a historic turning point. In the dark silence that followed the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, a distant echo began to resonate in the land of the exiles. It was the year 539 before Christ, and the fate of a people seemed to hang by a thread until an unexpected figure emerged on the horizon. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king whose ambition to unify and expand his empire would open the doors to a new chapter in the history of Jerusalem. The political context of this period is crucial to understanding the return of the Jews. After the devastating conquest of Nebuchadnezzar II and the destruction of the First Temple, the Jews found themselves in forced exile, scattered across the vast expanse of the Babylonian Empire. However, the fall of Babylon to the Persian armies led by Cyrus brought with it the promise of an uncertain yet hopeful future. Could the arrival of a new conqueror signify the restoration of their lost home? Cyrus was not only a conqueror, he was also an innovator in governance policy. His decree of restitution, known as the Edict of Cyrus, allowed the conquered peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This decree spread like a whisper among the exiled Jewish communities, awakening in them a deep longing for their land and their faith. The edict, which can be considered an act of benevolence or a political strategy to consolidate his influence, set the stage for reconstruction. How could a Persian leader become a symbol of salvation for a people that had suffered so much? Among the key figures in this drama were Zerubbabel, a descendant of the royal line of David, and Ezra, a priest and scribe whose knowledge of Jewish law would be fundamental to the spiritual restoration of the community. Zerubbabel was appointed as governor of Judea, and his leadership would become the catalyst for the reconstruction of the temple. With the Edict of Cyrus in hand, Zerubbabel led a group of approximately 50,000 Jews back to Jerusalem, a journey that symbolized not only a physical return but also a reaffirmation of identity and purpose. Upon their arrival, the scene they found was desolate. The ruins of the temple, a shadow of its former glory, stood as a reminder of pain and loss. However, among the worn stones and debris, the community began to glimpse the possibility of rebirth. The first task was the reconstruction of the altar, a symbolic act that represented not only the restoration of worship but also reconciliation with their history. The process of rebuilding the Second Temple was arduous and filled with challenges. The tensions between those who had remained in the land and those returning from exile complicated the efforts. The lack of resources and the opposition from neighboring peoples who viewed the resurgence of an ancient power with suspicion added further obstacles to the mission of Zerubbabel and Ezra. But despite the adversities, the Jewish people's drive to restore their home and spiritual center prevailed. In the year 516 before Christ, the Second Temple was finally consecrated, marking the beginning of a new era in Jerusalem. The immediate consequences of this return were profound. The restoration of the temple not only revitalized religious practice, but also helped to consolidate Jewish identity in a world that continued to change rapidly. Jerusalem became the center of a cultural and spiritual renaissance that would endure through the centuries. Nevertheless, despite this resurgence, the return also left unanswered questions. Was it truly a complete return? Or did the echo of Babylonian oppression still resonate within the walls of the new structure? The mystery left by this chapter is deep. Could the experience of exile have strengthened the faith of the Jewish people? Or had it left irreparable scars on their identity? What legacy was forged in the shadows of reconstruction? The history of Jerusalem, rich in nuances and contrasts, continues to unfold, and with each chapter a new enigma is revealed. As the echoes of this rebirth fade, the winds of change blow once more over the city. History moves toward the Hellenistic influence, where Greek culture would radically transform not only Jerusalem but the very concept of cultural identity. The next stage promises to be a journey through a changing world, where ancient traditions would confront new ideologies. How would Jerusalem react to the arrival of this new power? If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That reconstruction would soon be threatened by external forces that would alter the course of the history of Jerusalem, with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 before Christ. A new chapter opened before the city, marked by the arrival of Hellenistic influence. As the Macedonian troops dispersed and the conquered territories fragmented, Jerusalem found itself at a crossroads, a meeting point between local traditions and Greek influences that would soon leave an indelible mark on its development. The Hellenistic era, which would extend from the 4th century before Christ to the 1st century before Christ, not only brought about a change in political power, but also a cultural transformation. The political environment of this period was marked by the struggle for succession among Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, who vied for control of his vast territories. Ptolemy, one of the most influential, established his rule over Egypt and, with it, extended his influence over Jerusalem. This new order brought with it the challenge of integrating Greek culture with local traditions, a process that would generate tensions and conflicts that would reverberate through the centuries. Among the key figures of this period are individuals such as Ptolemy I Soter, who ruled Egypt and sought to consolidate his power in the region, and his successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, known for his ambition to make Alexandria an intellectual center of the world. However, the presence of the Seleucids, another of the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after the fragmentation of Alexander's empire, increased the political complexity. Antiochus III the Great, and later his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes, would become crucial figures in the history of Jerusalem, as their administration and policies would directly affect the Jewish population. Hellenism infiltrated every corner of daily life, from religion to education. The introduction of the Greek language and Hellenistic philosophy began to permeate Jewish culture, while the construction of new infrastructures and the founding of cities that followed the Greek model altered the urban landscape. But was this transformation truly an advancement, or a risk that threatened the traditions of a people? With the arrival of the Seleucids, Jerusalem experienced a change in its social and political structure. The imposition of heavy taxes and the pressure to adopt Greek customs generated discontent. However, the most significant challenge came with the policies of Antiochus IV, who attempted to suppress the Jewish religion and impose Hellenistic cults. This period of oppression would culminate in the Maccabean Revolt, an event that would mark a turning point in the history of Jerusalem. But before that spark of resistance could ignite, the city found itself embroiled in an internal conflict between the Hellenists and those who clung to their ancestral traditions. Despite the resistance, the changes were undeniable. Greek temples flourished in the city, and Hellenistic cultural practices found a place in the lives of many Jews. The influences on education and art were also palpable. Theatre, gymnasium, and sports activities began to take center stage in public life. Nevertheless, this cultural syncretism also raised unsettling questions. At what cost were these new customs being adopted? Were the Jews of Jerusalem truly aware of the legacy they were leaving behind? The immediate consequences of this Hellenistic influence marked a before and after in the identity of Jerusalem. The city, which had been a bastion of the Jewish faith, became a stage for cultural and religious conflict. The tension between the desire for modernization and the need to preserve cultural identity intensified, leading the population to question their place in the world. In this context of change and challenge, the echo of ancient traditions began to resonate with renewed urgency, posing a riddle that would persist through time. Could Jerusalem, amid its metamorphosis, find a balance between Hellenistic legacy and its Jewish heritage? As Hellenistic influence solidified, the conflict between these cultural identities became inevitable. Leaving Jerusalem on an unstable scale, the history of the city found itself at a critical juncture that foreshadowed future uprisings and resistance. The shadow of Hellenistic oppression loomed over the streets of Jerusalem, as the Jews prepared for a struggle that would define not only their existence but the fate of the city itself. The history of Jerusalem, now marked by Hellenistic influence, was heading toward a new chapter. The Maccabean revolt, looming on the horizon, would become a cry of resistance that would resonate through the centuries. Would the Jews manage to regain their autonomy and reaffirm their identity amid cultural tensions? The next stage in the narrative of this millennia-old city will take us to explore the forces that would rise against oppression and how the fighting spirit of a people could challenge even the most powerful authorities. That tension would soon give way to a new chapter in the history of Jerusalem, one marked by struggle, resistance, and the quest for freedom. The oppression under the Hellenistic rule of the Seleucids had sown the seeds of rebellion in the hearts of the Jews. A growing discontent reverberated in the streets of Jerusalem, where cultural and religious identity began to be threatened by the Hellenistic practices that invaded every corner of daily life. In a landscape where faith and culture intertwined, the spark of rebellion was about to ignite. The year 168 before Christ became a turning point. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, had imposed a regime of terror, prohibiting the practice of Judaism and desecrating the Temple of Jerusalem. This act of sacrilege echoed a broader strategy: to make Jerusalem a Hellenized city, where Jewish traditions would be relegated to the shadows. The pressure on the Jews to adopt Greek customs intensified, culminating in the placement of a statue of Zeus in the temple, an offense that would resonate deeply within the Jewish community. In this climate of desperation, a leader emerged whose name would resonate throughout history. Mattathias, a priest from the Hasmonean family. His challenge against a Seleucid official demanding idol worship ignited the flame of revolt. Mattathias, along with his 5 sons, became a symbol of resistance. But was it truly religious fervor that motivated this rebellion, or was there a deeper desire for autonomy and freedom? History often hides multiple layers of truth. After the death of Mattathias, his son Judas Maccabeus took the reins of the rebellion. His leadership was characterized by clever guerrilla tactics and an incredible ability to unite the various discontented Jewish groups. The first significant victory came in 167 before Christ at the Battle of Modin, where the Jewish resistance demonstrated that despite their numerical disadvantage, their determination was formidable. Victories continued, and each confrontation became an echo of hope for those yearning to reclaim their home and their faith. Judas was not only a military leader, his charisma and ability to inspire others made him a symbol of unity. In the year 164 before Christ, after a series of strategically won confrontations, the Maccabees succeeded in taking Jerusalem. The liberation of the temple, its purification and rededication, known as the Festival of Hanukkah, became an event that not only marked a military victory but also a spiritual renaissance. However, the echoes of war still resonated, and the struggle for independence was not over. The Hasmonean dynasty that emerged from this revolt would be a complex and contradictory legacy. While Judas and his brothers fought for religious and cultural freedom, their successors would soon find themselves caught in political intrigues and power struggles. The independence achieved would sometimes turn into despotism and internal conflicts. What secrets awaited in the depths of this new era? The history of the Hasmoneans is a testament to how even the purest ideals can be corrupted by power. The immediate consequences of the Maccabean revolt were profound. The restoration of worship in the temple allowed for the revitalization of Jewish identity. But it also brought new tensions. As the Hasmoneans consolidated their power, they began to face the emerging powers of their time, including the Romans. The proclamation of Jerusalem's independence was a cry for freedom, but also a call to the constant struggle for survival in a constantly changing world. The enigma of the chapter of the Maccabean Rebellion lies in the question of whether the freedom conquered by the Jewish people could have been a true refuge, or if, in their quest for autonomy, they sowed the seeds of future discord. The story of the Maccabees serves as a reminder that the struggle for identity and independence often carries a high price. As the echoes of the rebellion resonated in Jerusalem, a new chapter opened in the history of the city, one in which Roman rule would begin to cast its shadow over the Jewish people. How would this new occupation change the fate of Jerusalem and its inhabitants? The answer to this question leads us to the next stage of this complex historical narrative: the Roman Empire and its influence on the Holy City. That independence would soon transform into a new chapter in the history of Jerusalem, one marked by the shadow of Roman power. In the year 63 before Christ, the Roman general Pompey, in his quest to expand the influence of Rome, carried out a series of military campaigns that would culminate in the annexation of Jerusalem. This event not only altered the course of the city, but also plunged it into a political and social context of unimaginable complexities. The arrival of the Romans in Jerusalem occurred in an atmosphere of instability and internal rivalries. The Hasmonean dynasty, which had emerged after the Maccabean revolt, was in crisis. The power struggles among different Jewish factions, as well as the pressure exerted by neighboring powers, left Jerusalem vulnerable. In this context, Pompey presented himself as a liberator to some, while others viewed him as a usurper. The city, which had been a bastion of Jewish autonomy, was on the verge of being absorbed by an empire that had forged its greatness through conquest. Among the key players in this drama was Hyrcanus II, the high priest of Jerusalem and a Hasmonean leader who, feeling cornered by his brother Aristobulus II, sought Roman support. Hyrcanus's decision to invoke Roman intervention would prove to be a turning point. In his pursuit of power, the priest allied himself with an empire that would soon transform the identity of Jerusalem forever. But was it truly a wise choice? History shows us that alliances forged in times of crisis often lead to unexpected consequences. Pompey's campaign was not merely the conquest of a city, it was the creation of a new order. Entering Jerusalem in the year 63 before Christ meant for the Romans not only controlling a territory but also delving into the heart of a culture deeply rooted in its traditions and beliefs. The city, with its imposing temple, was the symbol of the Jewish faith and a spiritual center overflowing with meaning. However, in taking control, Pompey did something that would resonate through the centuries. He allowed the Jews to maintain their religion, but under the shadow of Roman authority. This delicate balance would become the axis of future tensions. The Romans implemented a system of governance that, although nominally respecting Jewish traditions, was strongly controlled by Roman authorities. A new political order was established that, under the figure of the procurator, ensured that the voice of Rome was heard in all corners of daily life in Jerusalem. The figure of Herod the Great, who later emerged as a king appointed by Rome, would reflect this complex interaction between Jewish and Roman power. However, how much control did the Jews really have over their own lives in this new configuration? As the years progressed, tensions between the Romans and the Jews began to grow. The imposition of taxes, the Roman military presence in the city, and interference in religious matters became sources of discontent. Decisions made by Roman leaders, such as the construction of temples dedicated to pagan gods, unleashed the anger of a people who saw their identity threatened. The echo of Jewish resistance began to sound, a prelude to the conflicts that were looming. The immediate consequences of the Roman annexation were profound. Jewish culture, rich in traditions and rituals, was permeated by the influence of an empire that, although powerful, did not fully understand the complexity of its new domain. The city once again became a battleground, not only physical but also ideological. Divisions grew, and with them the need for a response that could restore the lost autonomy. Nevertheless, the enigma that persists in historical memory is this: could Rome have chosen a different path? Would it have been possible to achieve a balance that allowed Jerusalem to flourish under Roman influence without sacrificing its cultural essence? As history unfolds, the echo of these questions resonates with the same strength as the foundations of the sacred city. The tensions that arose in the Roman context were not mere local disputes, they were reflections of a broader struggle for identity and faith. The arrival of Herod the Great, who would become the next protagonist of this story, would mark a new chapter in the narrative of Jerusalem. His ambition and architectural reforms would transform the city, but they would also intensify the tensions that were already beginning to take shape. As the Roman legacy settled upon the ancient stones of Jerusalem, history moved forward, and with it, the inevitable confrontation that was brewing on the horizon. What future awaited Jerusalem? The answer lay in the hands of those who, amid uncertainty, sought to regain control of their destiny. The next chapter, the era of Herod, will take us to explore how this intriguing king faced the challenges of governing in a world where faith and power were inextricably intertwined. That tension would soon transform into an opportunity for a restless visionary. In the heart of Jerusalem, the echo of a new dawn began to resonate. Herod the Great, a king whose figure, shrouded in controversy and ambition, rose at a time when Jerusalem struggled for its identity under Roman rule. This chapter, the era of Herod, reveals the architectural metamorphosis of Jerusalem, marked by the grandeur of the Second Temple and the ambition of its king. The historical context in which this era unfolds is fundamental to understanding the magnitude of Herod's reforms. Following the Roman annexation of Jerusalem in 63 before Christ, the city found itself in a state of constant tension. The frictions between the Romans and the Jewish population were palpable, and resentment towards the occupation was growing. However, amid this turbulent climate, Herod emerged as a pragmatic and shrewd leader. Born into an Idumean family, his rise to power was supported by his ability to manipulate the political complexities of the time. The influence of Rome granted him resources and legitimacy, but it also bound him to the expectations of his rulers. The characters who played a crucial role in this narrative are Herod, of course, but also his advisors and architects, and the Emperor Augustus himself, whose approval was essential for any large-scale project. Herod, with a vision that transcended his time, made bold decisions that would reform not only the architecture of Jerusalem, but also its very soul. The development of the events that led to the monumental expansion of the Second Temple began in 20 before Christ. When Herod decided that the structure, deemed insufficient for the growing Jewish population and their religious devotion, needed a radical transformation, the original building, which had been painstakingly rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, was seen as a symbol of Jewish identity, but Herod wanted more. With unbridled ambition, he proposed a plan that would not only enhance the temple itself, but also transform the surroundings of Jerusalem into an unparalleled center of pilgrimage. With Augustus's approval, Herod initiated the work. The expansion of the temple became a monumental project that involved thousands of workers and artisans. The foundations were reinforced with magnificent precision, and the new white marble structures shone under the desert sun, a symbol of the greatness that Herod aspired to achieve. The temple not only expanded in size, but was also adorned with luxurious finishes and embellishments that defied imagination. In his quest to dazzle, Herod integrated Hellenistic elements into his design, creating a space that fused Jewish tradition with Roman modernity. However, Herod's ambition was not limited to the temple. The city of Jerusalem underwent a comprehensive transformation. New squares, markets, and public buildings emerged, all bearing the architectural imprint of the king. The construction of the fortress of Masada, the renovation of the port of Caesarea, and the building of palaces in Jericho are just a few examples of how his influence extended beyond the confines of the sacred city. But at what cost? The immediate consequences of Herod's work were significant. The expansion of the temple attracted thousands of pilgrims, revitalizing the local economy and rekindling fervent religious devotion. However, this splendor also awakened distrust and resentment among the more orthodox factions of Judaism. For some, Herod's innovations were seen as a betrayal of the purity of faith. The echo of discontent resonated in the streets, and the shadows of discord began to loom over the city. The enigma of the chapter lies in the duality of Herod the Great, a king who, in his pursuit of greatness, transformed Jerusalem into a symbol of splendor and at the same time sowed the seeds of discord among his people. Was he truly a benefactor who elevated Jerusalem to new heights? Or a tyrant whose personal ambitions led to the fracture of Jewish identity? As the era of Herod came to a close, the architectural legacy of his reforms would endure, but so would the tensions he had exacerbated. The history of Jerusalem would advance, marked by the contrast between the magnificence of the temple and the internal struggles of its people, leading to events that would culminate in the devastating destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 after Christ. What secrets still awaited in the depths of this sacred city, and how would they shape its destiny in the years to come? As the dust of Herod's work settled, a new chapter was preparing to reveal itself. The history of Jerusalem would head towards its next great crisis, the Jewish revolt and the eventual destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, an event that would forever change the course of its history. The shadows of Roman occupation loomed once more, heralding an uncertain future filled with challenges. That was a time of rising tensions and conflicting ambitions in Jerusalem, where the echo of a glorious past still resonated in the stones of its roads. The shadow of the Roman Empire loomed over the city, and the beats of Jewish resentment began to mark the rhythm of an imminent revolt. In the year 66 after Christ, discontent transformed into a palpable clamor, initiating the Great Jewish Revolt. This uprising would not only challenge Roman authority, but also determine the fate of Jerusalem and its legendary Second Temple. The political context of this era was defined by Roman oppression, which had imposed heavy tax burdens and a regime of control that stripped the Jews of their autonomy. The figure of Emperor Nero, with his unbridled ambition, and the administration of the governor of Judea, Gessius Florus, heightened the tension in an already volatile environment. Florus, by showing disdain for Jewish traditions, unleashed a series of altercations that ignited the fire of insurgency. How could such a vast empire overlook the fervor of a people determined to reclaim their freedom? In this landscape, key Jewish leaders emerged, such as Eleazar ben Simon and his brother Simon bar Giora, who became symbols of resistance. Eleazar, by taking control of the temple, transformed this sacred place into a stronghold of the struggle. With unwavering determination, the Jewish leaders made bold decisions, such as attacking the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, leading to the initial victory of the insurgents and the capture of the fortress of Masada. However, this victory would be fleeting, as Roman power would soon concentrate its forces to crush the rebellion. Events unfolded rapidly. In the year 70 after Christ, the Roman general Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, was sent to quell the revolt. His campaign was meticulously planned, and the Romans, with their relentless military machinery, began the siege of Jerusalem. The walls of the city, which had once been a symbol of resistance, became a prison for its inhabitants. Desperation and hunger began to besiege the population, while attempts at resistance grew increasingly desperate. What could have driven a people to resist under such conditions? Even in the face of certain defeat, the siege culminated in a devastating attack in August of the year 70 after Christ. Roman troops stormed the city, and the temple, which had been the spiritual and cultural center of the Jews, was consumed by flames. The destruction of the Second Temple was not only a physical disaster, it was a devastating blow to the heart of Jewish identity. The stones, which had heard the prayers of generations, turned to dust, and with them, a legacy faded away. The lingering question is, how can a people rebuild their identity after such a monumental loss? The consequences of this destruction were immediate and profound. The Jewish diaspora intensified as survivors scattered throughout the empire seeking refuge in distant lands. The Jewish community, which had found in Jerusalem its home and center of spirituality, faced an uncertain future. However, despite the devastation, the spirit of resistance remained alive. Synagogues began to emerge as new centers of worship and learning, and Judaism transformed, adapting to new realities. But how much of the original essence had been lost in the process? Thus, the destruction of the Second Temple left an enigma, a mystery that endures to this day. How can the irretrievable be reclaimed? The history of Jerusalem would continue, but its fabric had been irrevocably torn. In the shadows of its ruins, a new narrative was taking shape, one that combined suffering and hope, and that would shape future generations. As history progresses, the legacy of the destruction of the temple intertwines with the transformation of Jerusalem under Byzantine rule, where the city would become an epicenter of religious fervor, but also of new conflicts. The traces of the past would echo in every stone, and the mystery of its history would continue to unfold. What secrets still awaited in the depths of Jerusalem, where faith and history merge into a single destiny? That crisis would soon give way to a new order in Jerusalem. After the devastation caused by the Roman war and the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 after Christ, the city lay shrouded in the silence of its ruins, a shadow of its former splendor. However, amid this desolation, the fate of Jerusalem would become a fascinating enigma under Byzantine rule, a period that would transform its essence and elevate it to the heart of Christianity. During the 4th century, the Roman Empire found itself at a crossroads. The conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity in the year 312 after Christ marked the beginning of a new era. With the Edict of Milan in 313, the practice of Christianity was legalized, and the faith began to flourish in an empire that had, until then, persecuted its followers. Jerusalem, which had been a symbol of suffering and loss, emerged as a beacon of hope and faith. The city would not only be rebuilt, but would also transform into a crucial spiritual center for Christians from all over the world. Emperor Constantine, aware of the symbolic power of Jerusalem, decided to undertake a series of reforms that would change the course of history. In his ambition to establish a lasting legacy, he ordered the construction of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre at the site where, according to Christian tradition, the tomb of Jesus was located. This monumental edifice would not only be a place of worship, but also a symbol of the Christian claim over a space that had been marked by suffering and violence. But was it truly a restoration of the sacred or a reconfiguration of power? The construction of the basilica, completed in the year 336, was erected as an act of faith and politics. The remnants of pagan temples were dismantled, and each stone placed in the new structure seemed to resonate with the echo of ancient beliefs. In this context, the figure of Constantine becomes essential. His decision to recognize and promote Christianity transformed Jerusalem into a sacred place, attracting pilgrims and devotees from all parts of the empire. However, the question lingers: what hidden interests guided the emperor in his quest for a new religious order? As Christianity consolidated, the population of Jerusalem began to change. The Jewish inhabitants, who had been the custodians of the city for centuries, saw their influence fade in an increasingly hostile environment. Throughout history, Jews had maintained an unwavering presence in Jerusalem, but the arrival of a new spiritual and political power would forever alter the dynamics of the city. The construction of the church became a symbol of the marginalization of the communities that had once called this place home. With the rise of Christianity, daily life in Jerusalem also experienced significant changes. Religious festivities, processions, and ceremonies became part of the social fabric of the city. The streets, which had once witnessed cultural and religious diversity, began to resonate with the songs of Christians celebrating their faith in a place they now considered sacred. However, in this new order, the voices of Jews and pagans were gradually silenced. What secrets lay hidden behind the closed doors of this transformation? The 4th and 5th centuries witnessed a cultural and religious flourishing in Jerusalem, but also latent tensions. Doctrinal disputes began to arise among the different factions of Christianity. The Council of Nicaea in 325 had established a framework for Christian orthodoxy, and Jerusalem became an ideological battleground, the figure of the church represented by its bishops, consolidated as a political power in the city. Among these leaders, Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem stood out for his fervor and commitment to the faith, but also for his rejection of coexistence with other beliefs. His influence and decisions marked a period of intensification of religious tensions. Did the pursuit of truth in faith bring with it the shadow of intolerance? The rise of Jerusalem as a Christian center had immediate consequences. The increase in pilgrims brought wealth and prosperity, but also social tensions. Jewish communities began to suffer attacks and persecutions, and their rights were restricted. The city, which had been a melting pot of cultures and religions, remained on the brink of latent conflict. In this context, the legacy of Constantine and his successors became ambiguous. Were they truly the architects of a new dawn, or the bearers of the dark night of intolerance? The arrival of the 6th century brought with it a new empire, that of Justinian, who continued the work of his predecessors. His ambition was monumental: to restore the ancient splendor of Rome and consolidate Christianity as the only religion of the empire. In this endeavor, Justinian not only renewed the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, but also built other churches and monuments that reflected the power of the Christian faith. However, his reign was also marked by increasing pressure on non-Christian communities, leading to a climate of tension and resentment. Meanwhile, relations among the different Christian factions became even more complex. Disputes between the Orthodox and the Monophysites, who held that Christ had a single divine nature, led to a series of conflicts that overshadowed the atmosphere of faith that had been attempted to be built. Jerusalem, which had been a bastion of unity, was becoming an ideological battleground. In this context of division and struggle, the question persists: could faith truly unite a people when the differences were so pronounced? As the end of the Byzantine period approached, Jerusalem found itself at a crossroads. The arrival of new currents of thought and the pressure from external forces began to threaten the status of the city. However, its importance as a spiritual center never faded, and its legacy continued to resonate through the centuries. The city had transitioned from being a symbol of suffering to becoming an epicenter of hope and faith. But what mysteries still lay in its deep roots, waiting to be discovered? The transformation of Jerusalem under Byzantine rule left an indelible mark on its history. The city, which had been a melting pot of cultures and beliefs, became a symbol of the Christian faith, but at a high cost. The tensions that arose, the decisions of its leaders, and the sacrifices of its inhabitants intertwined into a legacy that is still felt today. There was an air of mystery in the way this new order had developed, and the history of Jerusalem would continue to reveal its secrets in the next chapter, when the arrival of Islam would give an unexpected twist to its destiny. That transformation would not stop at the confines of the Byzantine Empire. As the city adapted to a new Christian order in the vast sands of the Arabian desert, a new message began to resonate. The arrival of Islam in the 7th century would bring with it a profound echo that would reverberate in the stones of Jerusalem, changing its destiny forever. In the historical context of this time, the world was in a state of upheaval. The Arabian Peninsula, fragmented into tribes and clans, was on the cusp of a radical change. The figure of Muhammad emerged as a beacon of unity and hope, preaching a message of monotheism that resonated with the spiritual quest of his time. Meanwhile, Jerusalem, in its role as a sacred city for Jews and Christians, remained a reference point amid a sea of political and religious uncertainties. Its importance was not only geographical, it was the heart of a religious tradition that spanned millennia. But what would happen when the Islamic faith began to claim its place on this stage? The key figures in this narrative are undoubtedly both Muhammad and the caliphs who followed him. After the death of Muhammad in the year 632 after Christ, his legacy would be carried out by his successors, known as caliphs. The Islamic expansion became rapid and overwhelming, and among its objectives was the conquest of Jerusalem, a city revered for its history and spirituality. In the year 636 after Christ, under the leadership of Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, the Muslim armies prepared for a decisive confrontation. The siege of Jerusalem began in a tense atmosphere. The Byzantine forces, under the command of the Eastern Roman general, Patriarch Sophronius, had fortified themselves. The city, with its imposing walls and Christian legacy, seemed an invulnerable bastion. However, the momentum of the Muslim conquerors was relentless. With a fervent and determined army, the Muslims sought not only to expand their territory but also to establish Jerusalem as a sacred place for Islam. In parallel to their veneration for Mecca and Medina, the events that unfolded during the siege are worthy of an epic chronicle. For months, the Muslim troops surrounded the city, while the Byzantines defended their walls with tenacity. But on the 15th of July in the year 637 after Christ, after a long and arduous siege, Jerusalem surrendered. The arrival of Caliph Omar in the city was a moment laden with symbolism. Upon entering, it is said that his first action was to head to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a place of great importance for Christians, and there, in a gesture of respect, he refused to pray within its walls, so as not to set a precedent that could be misinterpreted by future Muslims. This act, though subtle, revealed Omar's intention to govern with a mix of respect and pragmatism. The immediate consequences of this conquest were profound and multifaceted. The establishment of Muslim rule in Jerusalem not only signified a change of political power but also a redefinition of the religious identity of the city. Omar, in his role as ruler, committed to protecting Christians and Jews, guaranteeing their right to practice their faith. This pact of coexistence would become a model to follow in the years to come, although, like any complex story, it would not be free of tensions. However, despite this period of relative peace, the enigma that persisted was that of the identity of Jerusalem itself. How could a city so sacred to three religions maintain its significance in a context of conflict and rivalry? The echoes of this conquest would resonate through the centuries, leaving unanswered questions about coexistence and faith. The arrival of Islam had changed the face of Jerusalem, but the city's relationship with the rest of the world would continue to be a developing mystery. In the end, the shadow of Islam had settled over Jerusalem, transforming its spiritual and physical landscape. New challenges loomed on the horizon, and soon the city would find itself immersed in a sea of crusades and conflicts that would once again test its resilience and legacy. The history of Jerusalem would continue, but the seeds of confrontation had been sown, and so, with the echo of Omar's words resonating in the walls of the city, we delve into the next chapter of this saga. The Crusades, a conflict that would sear the history of Jerusalem and its inhabitants, where faith and war intertwined in a labyrinth of loyalties and betrayals. What new secrets would be unveiled in this arena of confrontation and religious fervor? That transformation of Jerusalem under Islamic rule would soon be challenged by a series of events that would resonate throughout history, leaving an indelible mark on its legacy. By the end of the 11th century, the echo of war resonated across Europe, where a combination of religious fervor and territorial ambitions awakened a crusading spirit that would head towards the Promised Land. The Crusades, driven by the call of Pope Urban II in 1095, became a phenomenon that would forever change the face of Jerusalem. The historical context preceding the Crusades was marked by unprecedented religious fervor. As Christianity consolidated in Europe, The idea of reclaiming the holy places became a moral imperative for many. The fall of Jerusalem to the Muslims in 638 had left a deep wound in the Christian heart, and the subsequent consolidation of the city as a major Islamic center under the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs only fanned the flames of the desire to regain control. The fragility of trade routes and the growing threat of the Seljuk Turks, who had begun to advance westward, added pressure to the situation. It was a time of tensions where the remoteness of the Holy Lands felt like an echo of a glorious past. The figures who would play crucial roles in this historical drama began to emerge. One of the most prominent was Godfrey of Bouillon, a French nobleman who would become the symbol of the crusading ideal. With an army composed of knights and peasants, Godfrey would lead the first crusade to Jerusalem, driven by the promise of redemption and glory. Alongside him, figures such as Raymond IV of Toulouse and Bohemond of Taranto would also shape the course of this crusade. In the background, Pope Urban II, with his call to arms, had ignited the spark of a conflict that presented itself as a holy war, a struggle not only for land, but for the Christian soul, with the support of thousands of crusaders. The First Crusade embarked on a journey filled with sacrifices and challenges. After a series of victories in cities such as Nicaea and Antioch, the Crusader army finally lifted the siege of Jerusalem in June of 1099. The city, which had been a symbol of unity and faith for Christians, was about to be rediscovered after more than 4 centuries of Islamic rule. But at what cost? The siege of Jerusalem became a testament to the brutality of war. After a month of intense fighting, on the 15th of July in 1099, the walls of the city were breached, allowing the Crusaders to enter in a frenzy of victory and vengeance. The streets of Jerusalem were stained with blood as the Crusader soldiers carried out an indiscriminate massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The echo of their screams still resonates in the collective memory of the city. The conquest culminated in the proclamation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with Godfrey of Bouillon as its first ruler, although he refused to crown himself as king, preferring the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marked a turning point. In a symbolic act, the city was divided into districts that reflected its religious diversity. Christian temples began to flourish, and the city became a center of pilgrimage for thousands of Christians across Europe. However, tensions did not dissipate. The Crusader victory left a legacy of antagonism that would manifest in the years to come. The presence of a small Christian state amidst a vast Muslim territory raised unsettling questions. Could this Kingdom of Jerusalem withstand the growing pressure from Muslim leaders who were already beginning to plan their response? The following years saw the consolidation of Crusader control, but also the birth of a riddle. Despite their victory, the Crusaders found themselves surrounded by a sea of hostility and distrust. Government structures were established. But the lack of cohesion among the different groups of Crusaders and local resistance began to erode the precarious peace. With each passing year, the shadow of their own ambition began to cast itself over their achievements. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, although a testament to the Crusader victory, posed a series of unanswered questions. Could it truly coexist in such a hostile environment, or was it destined to be just a fleeting chapter in the long history of Jerusalem? The tension hung in the air like an imminent storm, the calm that precedes a conflict. The question lingered: would this kingdom be a beacon of faith or a source of new divisions? As the waves of history pushed and pulled at Jerusalem, a new actor was preparing to enter the scene. The next chapter would reveal the figure of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who would rise as a symbol of resistance and unity in the face of the crusading threat. His legacy, like that of those who preceded him, would be a resonant echo in the history of this sacred city. How would Saladin confront the challenge of the Kingdom of Jerusalem? History was about to take a dramatic turn. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That struggle for control of Jerusalem not only marked an era of conflict, but also left a profound imprint on the history of the city, an echo that would resonate through the centuries. The arrival of Saladin, A formidable and astute leader signified the rebirth of Islam in the sacred city. In this chapter, we will delve into the Ayyubid rule, a period that would transform the fate of Jerusalem and is framed within the context of the Crusades, a series of religious wars that shook the medieval world. During the 12th century, the political landscape of the region was a mosaic of conflicting powers. Following the successful conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099, the city became a Christian stronghold, a symbol of faith and an object of desire for Muslims. However, as time progressed, Muslim unity began to take shape in the shadows, in an effort to reclaim what had been lost. Among the most prominent figures of this renaissance was Saladin, whose name rose as a beacon of hope for many Muslims of the time. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, Saladin, whose real name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a distinguished military and political leader. His ancestry from a Kurdish family endowed him with a sense of identity that guided his actions. From a young age, Saladin stood out for his military talent and his ability to unite the disparate factions of Islam. In the context of a divided world, his vision and decisions were crucial. In 1171, Saladin became the Sultan of Egypt, unifying the territory under his leadership and establishing the Ayyubid dynasty. This event was a milestone in Islamic history, as it laid the groundwork for the recovery of Jerusalem. However, Saladin's rise was not an easy path. His strategic decisions began to outline a new approach in the struggle against the Crusaders. He recognized that the fragmentation of Islam under various leaders was a weakness that needed to be overcome. To this end, he sought alliances and consolidated his power in Egypt and Syria. In 1174, following the death of the King of Jerusalem, Mamluk I, Saladin saw an opportunity to act. The instability in the Crusader kingdom left the city vulnerable. The conflict culminated in 1187, when Saladin launched a bold campaign against the Crusaders, uniting Muslim troops under his command. The Battle of Hattin became the decisive stage, a confrontation that would change the course of history. On a hot day in July, Saladin used his knowledge of the terrain and his military cunning to defeat a Crusader army that had underestimated his strength. The exhausted and demoralized Christian forces suffered a crushing defeat. But was it really so? What secrets still awaited in the depths of this confrontation? The victory at Hattin was a catalyst, allowing Saladin to march towards Jerusalem. The city, which had witnessed brutality and bloodshed, now stood on the brink of a new era. In September of 1187, after a prolonged siege, Saladin finally managed to reclaim the city. As the walls of Jerusalem rose before his troops, a mantle of hope unfolded over the hearts of Muslims. He was not only reclaiming territory, he was restoring a legacy. The immediate consequences of the recovery of Jerusalem were profound. Saladin, in a surprising gesture of clemency, allowed Christians to remain in the city and guaranteed their safety. This act of magnanimity contrasted sharply with the brutality of the previous Crusader siege. By establishing a new order, Saladin not only consolidated his power but also left a legacy that would resonate in the hearts of Muslims for generations. However, the question persists. Was the Ayyubid rule truly the culmination of a Muslim dream, or merely the beginning of a new cycle of conflicts for control of Jerusalem? As the figure of Saladin rose as a symbol of unity and resistance, the enigma of his leadership and the consequences of his decisions lead us to reflect on the future of the city. His legacy would continue to be a beacon in history, but it would also sow the seeds of new tensions. With the arrival of the Ayyubid dynasty, Jerusalem was entering a period of changes that would set the stage for the coming eras. In the next chapter, we will delve into the Mamluk Era, a period that, although it emerged from Ayyubid rule, would bring with it new architectural and administrative transformations that would forever change the face of Jerusalem. What secrets and mysteries will be hidden in the foundations of this new era? That stage would soon give way to a period of radical transformation in Jerusalem as the Ayyubid rule, with its legacy of conquest and resistance, left its mark in every corner of the city. The arrival of the Mamluks, a group that had emerged from the shadows of servitude, would mark a new chapter in the history of this revered city. In the 13th century, the Mamluks, an elite military of slaves turned warriors, would take control of Egypt and by extension of Jerusalem, establishing a period that would last until the arrival of the Ottomans in the 16th century. This chapter will explore the Mamluk administration and the architectural changes that transformed the city, revealing a mystery that continues to resonate in the echoes of its stones. The historical context preceding the Mamluk era is imbued with conflicts and shifts in power. After Saladin's victory in 1187, Jerusalem had regained its status as a place of crucial importance for the Islamic world. However, political instability persisted. The fragmentation of leadership and the threat of the Crusades not only affected the city, but also created a vacuum that the Mamluks would be willing to fill. This atmosphere of uncertainty would become conducive to the rise of the Mamluks, who, after defeating the Crusaders and consolidating their power in Egypt, turned their gaze towards Jerusalem. Among the most prominent leaders of this era was Qutuz, a Mamluk sultan who, in 1260, led his troops to a decisive victory against the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut. This victory not only saved Egypt, but also secured Mamluk influence in the region. Qutuz's decision to reaffirm control over Jerusalem, a sacred place for both Muslims and Christians, was a turning point. In turn, his successor, Baybars, would emerge as a key figure in Mamluk history, expanding and fortifying the city and establishing a government that prioritized defense and economic prosperity. The unfolding of events during the Mamluk era in Jerusalem was a continuous process of transformation. In establishing their government, the Mamluks not only focused on military control, but also promoted architecture and culture. The city, which had been a battlefield, began to flourish under their administration. New mosques, schools and markets were built, which not only beautified the city but also served as centers of learning and commerce. The Mosque of Al-Nasir Muhammad, for example, is an impressive testament to this period, showcasing Mamluk architectural skill and their desire to emulate the greatness of past eras. In addition to religious architecture, the city's infrastructure also underwent significant changes. The walls of Jerusalem were improved, and caravanserais were built, serving as shelters for travelers and merchants, facilitating cultural and economic exchange. In this context, Jerusalem not only solidified its status as a religious center, but also as a vital commercial hub between East and West. However, amid this flourishing, the question arises: what secrets and tensions lay hidden behind the facade of prosperity? The immediate consequences of Mamluk administration were profound. The city became a symbol of resistance against foreign invasion, and its population, composed of Muslims, Jews, and Christians, experienced a period of relative stability and coexistence. Mamluk influence extended beyond architecture and the economy. A cultural renaissance was also promoted, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Jerusalem. However, this era of splendor was not without challenges. Tensions between religious communities and internal power struggles remained latent, raising questions about the sustainability of this apparent peace. The enigma of the chapter centers on the legacy of the Mamluks and their lasting impact on Jerusalem. Despite the cultural and architectural advancements, the question persists: was this truly an era of peace and prosperity? Or did the shadow of instability continue to lurk in the streets of the city? The history of Jerusalem has always been marked by the duality of light and shadow, progress and conflict, leading us to wonder how these dynamics would evolve in the years to come. As the Mamluks solidified their control, a new chapter began to take shape in the city, one that would lead Jerusalem into a long period of Ottoman rule. This architectural, political, and social legacy would intertwine with future events, setting the stage for the complex history that is yet to come. In the next chapter, we will explore how the arrival of the Ottomans would once again transform the face of this sacred city, shaping its destiny in the context of a constantly changing world. What surprises and secrets will this new era reveal? Only time will tell. That stability would soon transform into an opportunity for renewal, a period in which Jerusalem would fall under the vast mantle of the Ottoman Empire. It was a time of profound transformations in the ancient landscape of Jerusalem, a place that had witnessed conquests, religions, and cultures over the centuries. However, by the end of the 19th century, the city was on the brink of a new era, marked by the emergence of nationalist movements that would irrevocably change its destiny. In this context, the shadow of European imperialism began to cast itself over the region, provoking an awakening of national identities among both Jews and Arabs. At the twilight of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled these lands for centuries, was in a phase of decline. The echoes of the Industrial Revolution resonated in Europe, and with them, the idea of the nation-state began to take shape. In the atmosphere charged with social and political tensions, nationalism emerged as a response to the oppressions experienced by various peoples. The Jews, who had been victims of persecutions and displacements, began to seek the restoration of their ancestral home, Palestine. At the same time, the Arabs of the region started to conceive their own national identity, in contrast to Ottoman rule and European influence. The key figures in this narrative are individuals such as Theodor Herzl and his tireless struggle for Zionism, as well as Arab leaders who began to articulate demands for autonomy and recognition. Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist and writer, became the spokesperson for modern Zionism after the publication of his work, The Jewish State, in 1896. In this text, Herzl outlines the need for a Jewish national home, a place where Jews could live free from persecutions. His call resonated deeply within the Jewish diaspora, thus sowing the seeds of a movement that would seek to materialize in the land of their ancestors, the very land that had been the cradle of their millennia-old history. On the other hand, during the same period, a growing nationalist consciousness was emerging in the Arab world. Intellectuals and local leaders began to question Ottoman rule and to assert their own identity. The awakening of this consciousness was fueled by the influence of European ideologies and at the same time by the desire to reclaim the dignity and rights of a people that had been historically marginalized. The creation of cultural and political organizations in cities such as Jerusalem and Damascus pointed to a future where Arabs could define their own destiny. As the decade of 1890 progressed, Jewish and Arab nationalist movements began to intersect in their paths, creating a scenario of increasing tension and competition for control of the historical and territorial narrative. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland, where concrete plans were discussed to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. This event marked a milestone in the history of Zionism. But it also raised alarms among the Arabs living in the region. Who were these new voices claiming lands that they considered their home? The echo of these events reverberated in the streets of Jerusalem, where the Jewish and Arab communities began to see each other as rivals in a power game that was just beginning. The arrival of European Jews driven by Zionist ideals and in search of refuge was perceived as a threat by the local Arabs. In turn, the increase in the number of Jews was seen as an attempt at colonization, which fueled paranoia and resentment on both sides. Tensions soon manifested in clashes and disturbances, leaving a trail of distrust that deepened the division between the communities. The immediate consequences of the rise of nationalism were palpable in Jerusalem and its surroundings. The city, a microcosm of regional tension, became the epicenter of a conflict that was not only political but also emotional and cultural. The Jews, driven by their desire to return to their promised land, began to establish settlements in previously uninhabited areas, while the Arabs organized into movements to protect their rights and their land. This dynamic created an atmosphere of distrust, where every action was interpreted as a threat and where dialogue seemed a distant utopia. The enigma that emerges from this period is clear. Could two peoples with such intertwined histories and aspirations find a path toward coexistence? Or were they doomed to perpetual conflict? The history of Jerusalem, forged in the complexity of its cultures and religions, faces an uncertain future filled with shadows and promises. With the 20th century on the horizon, the decisions made by Zionist and Arab leaders would be crucial. Would it be possible for the arrival of modernity and the influence of foreign powers to offer a new hope for reconciliation, or would they only serve to intensify existing divisions? The answers to these questions would begin to unfold in the context of the British Mandate, where the echoes of rivalry and the search for identity would continue to resonate in every corner of Jerusalem. That tension would soon transform into a turning point for Jerusalem. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, the city found itself at a crossroads, caught between the echo of a glorious past and the shadow of an uncertain future. In this context, the British Mandate, established in 1920, would mark a crucial chapter in the history of Jerusalem, profoundly and durably shaping its political and social landscape. The British Mandate was instituted in an atmosphere of promises and tensions. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, had sown seeds of discord between the Jewish and Arab communities. While the Zionists celebrated British support for their aspirations, the Arabs viewed this declaration as a betrayal of their own claims to independence. Jerusalem, with its rich multicultural heritage, became the epicenter of these struggles, a chessboard where the pieces were in constant motion. The main characters in this historical drama included figures such as Herbert Samuel, the first British High Commissioner in Palestine, and Arab leaders like the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini. Samuel, a declared Zionist, sought to establish a balance between the communities, but his policies were perceived as biased by many Arabs who felt increasingly marginalized. Tensions escalated, and the decisions made by these leaders would not only define their legacy but also the fate of Jerusalem and its inhabitants. As the decade of 1920 progressed, British decisions became triggers for violence. The policy of Jewish immigration, which allowed the arrival of thousands of European immigrants, generated palpable resentment among the Arabs, who feared for their own future in a land they considered ancestral. The Arab revolts of 1920 and 1921, which erupted in response to the growing demographic and economic pressure, marked the beginning of a cycle of violence that would reverberate for years. The development of these events was accentuated by the British response, which oscillated between repression and attempts at reconciliation. The Hebron massacre in 1929, where several Jews were killed, was a turning point that highlighted the deep social fracture of the city. The British, caught between the demands of both communities, attempted to establish control that often resulted in hostility from both sides. How could the British, with their legacy of imperialism, find a solution to a conflict that had rooted so deeply in the history and identity of Jerusalem? As the decade of 1930 advanced, the climate of tension intensified further with the Great Arab Revolt, 1936 to 1939, an uprising that sought to end the British Mandate and Jewish immigration. The revolt exposed the inherent weaknesses of British administration, which was forced to confront organized and increasingly violent resistance. The use of force to suppress the revolt left deep wounds in Palestinian society and a legacy of resentment that would endure over time. The question lingered in the air: could peaceful coexistence ever be a reality in Jerusalem? The immediate consequences of the British Mandate became evident in the polarization of the communities. The city, once considered a symbol of religious and cultural unity, became a battleground of conflicting identities. The division between Jews and Arabs deepened, and tensions manifested not only in the political sphere but also in the daily lives of its inhabitants. The streets of Jerusalem, which had witnessed centuries of coexistence, turned into scenes of confrontation and distrust. However, the enigma surrounding the British Mandate is not limited to its immediate impact. The era of British rule left a complex legacy, a web of unfulfilled promises and frustrated aspirations that still resonates today. The question persists: what lessons can be drawn from this period of history? Was the British Mandate truly an attempt to stabilise the region, or rather a catalyst that fueled the conflict, as the British faced growing international pressure and local resistance? The situation in Jerusalem became increasingly untenable. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly would propose a partition plan that sought to address the demands of both communities. But the shadow of the British Mandate had already defined the path toward conflict, leaving Jerusalem as a symbol of the complexity and fragility of peace in a land marked by history. That unsustainable situation would soon open a new chapter in the complex history of Jerusalem. By the end of the decade of 1940, the echoes of the Second World War still resonated in the streets of Europe and the Middle East. The wounds of a devastating conflict intertwined with the struggle for national identity, while the aspirations of the Jewish and Arab peoples to establish their respective states reached a critical point. In this context, the United Nations partition proposal of 1947 emerged as an attempt to resolve a riddle that had persisted for centuries. Who would have the right to the land of Jerusalem? The political atmosphere of the time was tense and charged with expectations. The international community, deeply affected by the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people, found itself at a moral crossroads. The British Mandate in Palestine was coming to an end, and the pressure for a viable solution was intensifying. The United Nations, in an effort to ease tensions and prevent further violence, proposed a partition plan that would divide the territory into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem designated as an international enclave. This decision, driven by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, sought to offer a response to the history of dispossession and conflict that had marked the region. Among the key figures in this drama were David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish Agency, and King Abdullah of Jordan, who aspired to expand his kingdom at the expense of the Palestinian Arab population. Ben-Gurion saw in the partition a historic opportunity for the creation of the State of Israel, a dream he had nurtured since his youth. On the other hand, Abdullah, although initially showing interest in the idea of an Arab state, soon realized that the partition would not benefit Jordan as he had hoped. The Arab leaders, including those from Palestine, rejected the United Nations proposal, considering it a violation of their territorial rights. At this point, tensions were rising, and the decisions made by these actors would lay the groundwork for a conflict that would change the face of Jerusalem forever. On the 29th of November in 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of Resolution 181, which proposed the partition of Palestine. The reaction was immediate. In the Jewish communities, the announcement was met with jubilation, an opportunity to be reborn as a nation. However, in the Arab communities, the sentiment was one of anguish and rejection. In Jerusalem, a city that had been an epicenter of religious and cultural coexistence, the resolution unleashed a torrent of violence. Clashes between Jews and Arabs intensified, and the streets of the city, which had once witnessed peaceful exchanges, became the scenes of an imminent conflict. As violence erupted, acts of resistance and disproportionate reactions from both sides occurred. In December of 1947, several violent incidents, including attacks in the Arab neighborhood of Kataman and the bombing of Ben Yehuda Street, resulted in casualties, fueling distrust and hatred. The early phases of what would soon become an open war were already marked by a pattern of terror and retaliation that would repeat in the years to come. The immediate impact of the partition resolution was profound and heartbreaking. Jerusalem, which had been a symbol of hope and longing, was engulfed in a shadow of conflict. The city fragmented, and physical and psychological barriers began to rise between communities that, despite their differences, had coexisted for centuries. Ethnic and religious tensions sharpened, and each side prepared for the imminent struggle for control of the city and its sacred symbols. However, the true enigma looming over the events of 1947 was this spiral of violence and division inevitable? Could an alternative path to peace have been found? The United Nations proposal, although well-intentioned, left a legacy of distrust and conflict that would resonate for years. The question lingers in the air like an echo that refuses to fade. Who really has the right to Jerusalem? As the situation intensified and communities prepared for conflict, a new war loomed on the horizon. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 not only transformed the political geography of the region, but also fractured the very essence of Jerusalem, dividing the city and its population in a chapter of suffering and resistance that endures to this day. That crisis would soon overflow. In 1948, the echo of the promises and aspirations of the peoples inhabiting historic Jerusalem would resonate in a conflict that would mark the destiny of the city and the entire region. The Arab-Israeli War, which erupted amid a permanent political instability, would become a dark and decisive chapter in the history of the sacred city. The atmosphere of tension that permeated the Middle East in the decade of 1940 was charged with expectations and fears. The newly proclaimed Declaration of Independence of Israel on the 14th of May in 1948, led by David Ben-Gurion, resonated in the hearts of Jews seeking a home after centuries of diaspora and persecution. However, this declaration was not received with universal jubilation. The surrounding Arab nations, alarmed by the establishment of a Jewish state in what they considered their historic land, united in a coalition determined to crush what they saw as usurpation. Amid the shadows of this conflict, key figures began to shine and chart the destiny of Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion, a visionary yet polarizing leader, faced an unprecedented political and military complexity. On the Arab side, figures such as King Abdullah of Jordan and Egyptian leader Muhammad Naguib were preparing to send their troops, each with their own interests and agendas. Abdullah's decision to annex East Jerusalem, in particular, would become one of the most contentious points of the dispute. The development of events was dizzying. The war broke out almost immediately after the Declaration of Independence. In the days that followed, Israeli forces found themselves in a chaotic battlefield where the struggle for control of Jerusalem intensified. The city, a symbol of faith for Jews, Christians and Muslims, became the epicenter of a conflict that was not only territorial but also deeply spiritual. The fighting began on the outskirts of the city but soon moved into its streets. Clashes occurred in an atmosphere of fear and confusion. The civilian population, caught between bullets and despair, watched as their lives transformed into chaos. On the 28th of May in 1948, Israeli forces managed to capture the western part of Jerusalem, while Jordanian troops secured control of the eastern part, leaving the city divided in two. This division would create a legacy of separation and tension that would endure for decades. The immediate consequences of this war were profound. More than 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, a massive displacement that left an open wound in the collective memory of the Arabs. Jerusalem, a city that had been a symbol of coexistence, transformed into a bastion of division. The scars of war became visible in its urban landscape, and the history of its inhabitants intertwined with the narrative of a conflict that seemed endless. However, the enigma surrounding this chapter of Jerusalem's history manifests in the question: what future awaited a city marked by war and division? Could it ever heal the open wounds that had torn it apart? The struggle for the heart of Jerusalem was far from over, and its story intertwined with that of those who wished to reclaim their place in the narrative of the city. As the shadows of war loomed over the old city and its walls, a new chapter was brewing that would call the forces of history to action. The Six-Day War, which would erupt in 1967, promised to change the fate of Jerusalem once again, marking the beginning of a new conflict in which the echo of ancient aspirations would resonate anew. Could the city, among its millennia-old stones, find the peace it so longed for? That division would soon transform into a conflict of unexpected dimensions. In the context of a Middle East marked by political tensions and exacerbated nationalisms, the year 1967 stood as a decisive threshold. The wounds of the War of 1948 were still fresh, and the division of Jerusalem had cast a shadow of uncertainty over the future of the Holy City. The rivalry between Israel and its Arab neighbors intensified, fueled by a multitude of historical grievances and territorial aspirations. In this atmosphere of growing hostility, Israeli and Arab forces found themselves on the brink of a new confrontation, a conflict that would forever change the face of Jerusalem. The Six-Day War, which erupted in June of 1967, was more than a mere military contest. It was a phenomenon that encapsulated the complexity of a region marked by centuries of history. At the heart of this conflict were key figures such as Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Eshkol, who had assumed leadership during a period of political instability, faced increasing pressure from internal opposition and the threat of an attack by neighboring Arab states. Nasser, for his part, sought to consolidate his leadership in the Arab world, challenging Israel and mobilizing his allies in a show of strength. The atmosphere in the region became explosive when, on the 16th of May, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of the United Nations peacekeeping forces guarding the border between Egypt and Israel, an act that was interpreted as a precursor to the imminent war. Nasser's words echoed with a challenge, and his incendiary rhetoric spoke of the elimination of the Jewish state. Israel, sensing that the clouds of war loomed over its existence, made the decision to act preemptively. In the early hours of the 5th of June, the Israeli air forces launched a surprise offensive against Egyptian air bases, destroying much of their military capacity within hours. As the fighting intensified, attention turned to Jerusalem, a city of profound significance for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. As Israeli forces advanced, the city, divided between East and West, became the epicenter of a conflict that would resonate in the hearts of millions. In a bold move, General Moshe Dayan, who had been one of the main architects of the Israeli victory, led the operation to reunify Jerusalem. On the 7th of June, after intense fighting, Israeli troops entered the Old City, and their arrival was met with a mix of joy and fear, a moment that would be etched in collective memory. The reunification of Jerusalem under Israeli control was not merely a military triumph, it represented a profound change in the social and political fabric of the city. The echoes of gunfire and explosions mingled with the cries of joy from those who saw in this event the realization of a national dream. However, the complexity of the situation became evident. What did this victory truly mean for the inhabitants of Jerusalem? Both Jews and Arabs, the city, with its rich cultural and religious diversity, was now under a new administration that promised security but also awakened fears of repression and exclusion. The immediate consequences of the war were palpable. The annexation of East Jerusalem by Israel was followed by a series of policies aimed at integrating the city under a single government. However, this process was not without tensions. The Arab population of Jerusalem found itself caught between the celebration of the new order and the unease over the loss of their identity and rights. In this context, the legacy of the war became complicated, leaving unanswered questions. How would the Jerusalem of the future be defined? Would it be a symbol of unity or a perpetual battleground between conflicting identities? The shadow of the Six-Day War would not easily dissipate. The echo of its decisions would resonate for decades, shaping the course of Israeli-Palestinian relations. As history progressed, the enigma of Jerusalem's future became increasingly intricate. The reunification had brought with it a new reality, but it had also sown seeds of discord that would blossom into future conflicts. With the war recently concluded, the impact of these events would be felt in the years to come. The struggle for Jerusalem, both as a religious and political symbol, would continue to be a hot topic that defined the landscape of the Middle East. The echo of the decisions made during those days in June of 1967 would still reverberate in the streets of the city, challenging future generations to confront the reality of a divided Jerusalem, even as it was physically unified. But was it really so? Did reunification bring peace, or was it merely a new chapter in an endless story of conflict? The questions persist, and the mystery of Jerusalem remains an enigma in the search for a lasting resolution. As attention turns to the following years, the focus shifts to the times of tension that would follow, where the wounds of the War of 1967 would remain open and the future of Jerusalem would continue to be a subject of debate and discord. How would the communities confront the realities of the New Jerusalem, and what steps would be taken to address the still existing divisions in this sacred and complex city? That reunification would soon disrupt the fragile balance that had been established in Jerusalem after the Six-Day War. The decade of the 70s marked the beginning of a period of tensions in the city that would resonate through the decades, becoming a persistent echo of conflict and political aspirations. The political and social landscape grew increasingly complex, driven by a series of decisions that would shape not only the fate of Jerusalem but also that of the entire region. By the end of the 1960s, Jerusalem was under Israeli control, and the reunification of the city had awakened hopes in some sectors, while others felt a sense of loss and dispossession. The Palestinian population, which had been displaced during the War of 1948 and had lived in the shadow of occupation since then, increasingly felt the pressure of an environment that seemed to ignore their needs and rights. In this context, Palestinian leadership began to organize more effectively, seeking ways to resist the occupation and reclaim their rights over the city. Figures such as Yasser Arafat, who emerged as the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, began to articulate the aspirations of a people who refused to be forgotten. Tensions escalated as the Israeli government, under the leadership of figures such as Golda Meir, adopted an increasingly hardline stance towards any form of resistance. The settlement policy, which intensified starting in 1970, became a crucial point of friction. New Jewish neighborhoods were established in East Jerusalem, in areas that were considered by Palestinians as an integral part of their future state. This expansion not only altered the physical landscape of the city, but also intensified the feeling of alienation among Palestinians, who saw their lands being fragmented and their cultural identity threatened. During this period, several events would mark significant milestones in the rise of tensions. The year 1973 brought the Yom Kippur War, a conflict that, although fought in other parts of the region, had repercussions on the mood of the citizens of Jerusalem. The perception of vulnerability and the need for security became a priority for the Israeli government, leading to an increase in the militarization of the city and greater repression of Palestinian protests. But was it really security that guided these decisions, or was there a deeper desire to consolidate control over disputed territory? Amid this climate of tension, the arrival of the 80s brought a new wave of Palestinian resistance. The Intifada, which erupted in 1987, was a phenomenon that would awaken the international community to the Palestinian struggle in a way that had never happened before. Scenes of young people throwing stones at Israeli soldiers became symbols of resistance, while the image of Jerusalem transformed into a battleground for the hearts and minds of people. The decisions of the Israeli government in response to this uprising became increasingly controversial, and police and military repression generated a cycle of violence that only deepened the divisions. At the same time, the international community began to pay attention to the situation in Jerusalem, although the response was often ambiguous. United Nations resolutions and statements from world leaders seemed to clash with the reality on the ground, where Palestinians continued to suffer the consequences of an occupation that had become increasingly entrenched. Questions about the legitimacy of Israeli control over East Jerusalem became more frequent, and the city became a microcosm of a broader conflict that transcended borders. The decisions of Israeli leadership regarding settlements and the repression of Palestinian resistance also posed another enigma. Could a lasting solution arise from such a polarized environment? As the 90s approached, the accumulated tensions in Jerusalem transformed into a question that would resonate in future negotiations. The legacy of these tensions would continue to affect any attempts at peace, leaving the city trapped in a cycle of conflict and hope. In this context, the immediate impact of the Intifada was profound. Lives were lost, communities were divided, and wounds deepened. Palestinian resistance was not only organized in terms of violence but also articulated through a strong sense of national identity, a legacy forged in the streets of Jerusalem. Peaceful protests, although often repressed, began to emerge alongside violent uprisings, demonstrating the complexity of the struggle for self-determination. The enigma that this chapter leaves us with is clear. Can Jerusalem, a city marked by division and conflict, find a path towards reconciliation? The history of the city continues to unfold, while the shadow of the tensions from the 70s to the 90s continues to influence future generations. As we move into the next stage, the peace process of the 90s presents itself as a new chapter that promises significant changes but also faces monumental challenges. Can the lessons of the past illuminate the way towards a more hopeful future for Jerusalem? The search for answers to this question will lead us to explore the attempts to reach a peace agreement and its impact on this enigmatic city. Those tensions would soon transform into a labyrinth of negotiations, broken promises, and faded hopes. As the shadows of war receded after the conflict of 1967, a new chapter opened in the history of Jerusalem. The peace process. With the reunification of the city under Israeli control, the question that lingered in the air was, could this ancient enclave, witness to millennia of conflicts, finally find a path toward reconciliation? The historical context surrounding these peace attempts is as complex as the city itself. By the late 1960s, Jerusalem had become a symbol not only of national identity for Israelis, but also of aspirations and claims for Palestinians. The growing tension between these two narratives intertwined with the geopolitical realities of the Middle East. In a world where the echoes of the Cold War resonated in every corner, the situation in Jerusalem captured the attention of global powers, who saw in the city a microcosm of broader conflicts. Among the key figures in this historical drama was Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a leader with a militant past who had been at the forefront of the struggle for Jewish independence. His pragmatic approach and desire to establish a strong Jewish state clashed with the reality of a Palestinian people seeking their own self-determination. On the Palestinian side, the emerging figure of Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, embodied the fight for the rights of Palestinian Arabs. Arafat, with his charisma and determination, became the voice of a people who had been displaced and whose history was marked by loss. The crucial decisions of these leaders would be decisive in the unfolding of events. In 1978, under the mediation of American President Jimmy Carter, Begin and Arafat met at Camp David, a meeting that promised a new dawn. However, the path toward an agreement would be anything but straightforward. The discussions focused on thorny issues such as the status of Jerusalem, the return of Palestinian refugees, and the creation of a future Palestinian state. Could these figures, marked by their respective histories of pain and resistance, find common ground? The developments at Camp David were a microcosm of the tensions that characterized the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. While Begin defended the need to keep Jerusalem united under Israeli sovereignty, Arafat clung to the idea of East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. Hours turned into days and days into weeks, as tensions escalated, revealing not only political differences but also deep wounds and collective memories that seemed impossible to heal. In the end, the agreement reached at Camp David was a reflection of compromises that, while promising, failed to address the roots of the conflict. The immediate consequences of these peace attempts were palpable. While the Camp David Accords led to the signing of a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, the situation in Jerusalem remained tense. Palestinians who had hoped for a significant advance toward their self-determination felt disappointed. The perception that the peace process had not addressed their fundamental concerns fueled discontent that would manifest in the following decades. The city, which had been the epicenter of a historical struggle, became a symbol of frustration and longing. Thus, the enigma of the chapter looms over our reflections. What underlying secrets remain in the failed negotiations of Camp David? How can the decisions of a few impact the fate of millions? The search for peace in Jerusalem resembles a puzzle, where each piece represents not only political interests but also deeply rooted human aspirations. The city, with its history of conflicts and hopes, would continue to be the stage for a drama that was yet to unfold. As we move toward the next chapter, the wounds of these failures will resonate in a new context. The 21st century presents contemporary challenges that, like echoes of an unresolved past, will continue to shape the history of Jerusalem. Will the city find a path toward peace, or will it remain trapped in an endless cycle of conflict and hope? That peace process would soon transform into a contemporary enigma that would resonate in the echoes of Jerusalem's history. As the 21st century unfolded, the sacred city faced unprecedented challenges in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The ancient city, which had witnessed countless struggles and reconciliations, now found itself at a crossroads, a crucible of political, social, and religious tensions that threatened to tear apart the fabric of its community. The historical context framing these contemporary challenges was characterized by growing polarization. At the beginning of the new millennium, the legacy of decades of conflict manifested in a divided Jerusalem, where religious and nationalist symbolism intertwined in complex ways. The Second Intifada, which began in the year 2000, unleashed a wave of violence that reverberated throughout the city. The streets, once witnesses to peaceful coexistence, became the scene of clashes between Palestinians and Israelis, and the shadow of fear and distrust loomed over its inhabitants. In this landscape, key figures emerged who would attempt to navigate the turbulent waters of the conflict. Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister of Israel, made decisions that would profoundly shape the nature of the conflict. His visit to the Temple Mount in September of the year 2000, a sacred site for both Jews and Muslims, triggered a series of protests and violent confrontations. But was his visit truly a provocative act, or merely a trigger for latent tensions? Sharon's decisions not only impacted the political realm but also contributed to the polarization of narratives regarding the future of Jerusalem. Simultaneously, Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, found himself caught between the pressures of his own people and the demands of the international community. Peace negotiations, which had seemed to hold a glimmer of hope in previous decades, crumbled in the face of the reality of conflict on the streets. The lack of a definitive agreement on the status of Jerusalem, which both sides claimed as their capital, stood as an insurmountable wall. Arafat's decisions and his eventual isolation in the context of an intifada that exceeded the limits of his control left many wondering what future awaited the Palestinian cause in its own sacred city. As events unfolded, the separation wall rose as a tangible symbol of discord. Built by the Israeli government, this wall was justified as a security measure, but for many Palestinians it represented a new form of occupation and segregation. The scars this wall left on the urban landscape of Jerusalem were unsettling. Neighborhoods that once coexisted were now separated by a structure of concrete and barbed wire. What secrets still awaited in the depths of these physical and emotional divisions? In this labyrinth of concrete and pain, the future of Jerusalem seemed to be shaped by the hands of those who inhabited it. The events of this era had repercussions not only locally but also resonated on the international stage. The global community watched with growing concern as the conflict intensified. The tensions in Jerusalem became a microcosm of the struggle for human rights and self-determination, attracting the attention of human rights organizations and governments around the world. The decisions of international actors, from the United States to the European Union, reflected an ambivalence that further complicated the situation. Diplomatic interventions, often inconsistent and fragmented, fueled the sense that peace was an elusive goal, always in sight but never attained. As the 21st century progressed, the consequences of these events became increasingly evident. The tensions had transformed Jerusalem into a symbolic battleground, where not only a territorial struggle was waged, but also a battle for narrative. The city, rich in history and meaning, became a stage where identities clashed with unusual ferocity. Generations of youth on both sides, marked by conflict, found themselves trapped in a cycle of distrust that threatened to perpetuate the legacy of violence. In this context, the enigma of Jerusalem grew even deeper. Could a path to reconciliation be found in a city where historical wounds were so palpable? Could visions of a shared future transcend the shadows of the past? The search for answers to these questions became the thread that wove through the contemporary narrative of the city. As the international community sought to mediate and foster dialogue, the echoes of old conflicts continued to resonate in every corner of Jerusalem. The quest for a balance between national aspirations and religious identities resembled walking a tightrope. The challenge of Jerusalem in the 21st century was not only to find a political agreement but also to heal the wounds of a history marked by discord. And so, amid contemporary struggles, the city remained a symbol of faith and conflict. The dilemma of Jerusalem, therefore, was not a simple matter of territories and borders. It was, and continues to be, a labyrinth of emotions, beliefs, and hopes. How can history be reconciled with the desire for a peaceful future? The answer to this enigma, which still lingers in the consciousness of its inhabitants, lies at the crossroads where faith, suffering, and hope intertwine. Meanwhile, the journey toward understanding this complex facet of Jerusalem continues, immersing its inhabitants in the pursuit of lasting peace. As the 21st century advances, questions arise that still await answers. What legacy will the current generations leave for future ones? In this context of faith and conflict, the next chapter takes us to explore the complexity of Jerusalem as an epicenter of history. Spirituality and confrontation, a place where hopes and shadows coexist in a fragile balance. In the vibrant echoes of its history, Jerusalem stands as an enigma that has captured the imagination of generations. This latest chapter invites us to reflect on its complexity as the epicenter of faith, history, and conflict, where every stone and every street whispers tales of fervor and controversy. At the threshold of the 21st century, the city finds itself at a crossroads, a place where the shadows of the past intertwine with a turbulent reality. The last decades have been marked by a series of events that have left an indelible mark on the identity of Jerusalem, from the reunification following the Six-Day War in 1967 to the tensions that have resurfaced in the years that followed. The city has witnessed a conflict that is defined not only by political borders, but also by the depth of its beliefs. The diverse communities that inhabit Jerusalem, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, not only share a physical space, but are also intertwined in a narrative of faith that dates back millennia. The historical context surrounding Jerusalem is undoubtedly one of its most fascinating features. At the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, the world experienced a profound shift in its perceptions of religion and national identity. The Oslo peace process, which sought to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, seemed to offer a ray of hope. However, failures and disappointments have left a legacy of distrust. How is it possible that such a sacred and significant place for so many people continues to be a battleground? The decisions of leaders during this period have been crucial, from Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader who sought self-determination, to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister who has defended the sovereignty of his nation. These figures have played a central role in the events that have shaped the fate of Jerusalem. Negotiations, agreements, and at times breakdowns have created an environment filled with hope and despair. Can faith truly be reconciled with politics, or are they two worlds destined to clash? The unfolding events in Jerusalem have been marked by episodes of violence and resistance. The Second Intifada, which erupted in the year 2000, was a brutal reminder that the wounds of the past were still open. During this period, the city became a symbol of the Palestinian struggle. Every demonstration, every confrontation resonated with a story of pain and aspirations. But at the same time, Jewish communities continued to reaffirm their connection to Jerusalem, a place they consider the center of their spiritual existence. The immediate consequences of these events have left a profound impact. The division of the city into sectors, the construction of settlements, and the militarization of certain neighborhoods have created an urban landscape charged with tensions. Daily life in Jerusalem reflects this complexity. Religious festivities coexist with military surveillance, and the hope for a peaceful future faces the reality of a conflicted present. Can Jerusalem, a place that has been a focal point of devotion, ever become a symbol of peace? The enigma surrounding Jerusalem intensifies when we consider the identities that coexist within it. Each group holds its narrative, each with its truths and sufferings. The city, in its essence, becomes a microcosm of humanity, a place where faith and conflict intertwine in a complex fabric. What future awaits Jerusalem, a city that has been defined by its history but also struggles to forge a new destiny? As we reflect on this history, it is essential to recognize that Jerusalem is not simply a passive stage on which events unfold. It is a character in itself, alive and pulsating, that continues to evolve over time. The struggles and dreams of its inhabitants are a testament to their resilience, but also a reminder of the consequences of division and conflict. In the search for an answer to this panorama, we find ourselves immersed in a sea of uncertainties. Peace seems an elusive goal, while the echo of prayers and protests resonates in every corner of the city. What mysteries still lie waiting to be discovered in its ancient streets? And perhaps more importantly, will we be able to learn from the legacy that this city has left throughout its history? Through the centuries, Jerusalem has been a beacon of light and a battleground, a place where faith and conflict have written an intertwined narrative. This city, a symbol of aspirations and divisions, continues to challenge those who dare to explore its depths. In its uniqueness, Jerusalem reminds us that, although the wounds of the past are deep, the hope for a harmonious future can always be reborn. The end of our journey leaves us with a fundamental question. How can a place that has been a source of so much suffering also be the path to reconciliation? The story of Jerusalem does not end here. It is in constant evolution, a reminder that the quest for peace is ultimately a human endeavor. In the shadows of its streets, the echo of history resonates, inviting us all to reflect on the legacy we share and the future that is yet to be written. The city of faith and conflict stands not only as a testament to what has been, but also as a beacon of what could be.